Imagine standing on the tarmac of a quiet airfield, watching a plane descend out of a gray, indifferent sky. There's nothing unusual about it at first. The approach is steady, the angle looks right, the gear comes down exactly when it should. The wheels kiss the runway with a gentle squeal of rubber, and the plane rolls to a slow, almost dignified stop at the far end of the strip. You wait for the door to open. You wait for the pilot to climb down, stretch his legs, maybe wave to someone. You wait. And you wait, and nobody comes out. Nobody comes out because nobody is inside. The cockpit, when they finally pry open that door, is empty. The seat is there, the controls are untouched, the radio is still humming, the coffee in the cup holder, if there is one, is still warm. But the man who took off in that aircraft, the man who filed the flight plan, the man who taxied out onto the runway and pushed the throttle forward and lifted that machine into the sky, that man is simply gone. Not dead in his seat, not slumped over the controls. Gone. Vanished somewhere between the ground he left and the ground he returned to, and no one, not the investigators, not the experts, not the people who spent months or years picking through every shred of evidence, no one could ever fully explain where he went or how. This is not a ghost story, though it will feel like one. This is not science fiction, though it will stretch the limits of what you think is possible inside the rational, mechanical, thoroughly documented world of aviation. This is history. This happened more than once. And every single time it happened, the world looked at the empty cockpit, looked at the intact aircraft, looked at each other, and asked the same impossible question: where did the pilot go? Let us begin with the case that, more than any other, defines what we mean when we say ghost plane. The year is 1971. The place is the skies above the United States. The aircraft is a Cessna 150, a small two-seat single-engine plane of the kind that flight students learn on, that hobbyists rent on weekends, that crop dusters and private enthusiasts and small-town flyers keep at tiny regional airports all across the country. It is not a glamorous machine. It is workhorse and classroom both. And on a particular October morning, a man named Donald Dorius takes one of these planes up from a small airport in California with a student pilot in the right seat. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, a training flight. The kind that happens hundreds of times every day at airports just like that one, all across a country that has always had a love affair with the sky. But something happens up there, something that nobody on the ground witnesses, something that leaves no trace anyone can readily interpret. Because at some point during that flight, Donald Dorius is no longer in that plane. His student, frightened and overwhelmed, manages to keep the aircraft aloft through sheer adrenaline and whatever fragments of instruction he has absorbed, eventually guiding the Cessna down to a landing that is rough but survivable. He climbs out shaking. He tells his story. And investigators go looking for Donald Dorius and find eventually that he has fallen from the aircraft. How? The door? A mechanical failure? A moment of terrible misjudgment? The investigation produces answers of a kind, but the image of that plane coming back without the man who was flying it, burns itself into the record of aviation strangeness and never quite leaves. But that case, as haunting as it is, involves a student who can at least provide testimony. There are other cases where there is no one left to testify. No one at all. Just the plane, sitting there, engine still ticking as the metal cools, and total silence where a human being used to be. The story of the ghost plane reaches back further than most people realize, all the way to the earliest days of military aviation, when the machines were fragile and the men who flew them were pushing into territory that no technology could fully map. During the Second World War, there were documented instances of aircraft returning to base on autopilot, or through what seemed like sheer mechanical stubbornness, with the crew dead or missing. These were not mysteries that received wide attention at the time. Wartime censorship and the sheer overwhelming scale of the conflict meant that strange individual incidents were swallowed up in the noise of a world at war. But they were recorded. They were noted. They went into files that historians would later unearth and stare at with the same puzzled expression that the first responders must have worn when they opened those cockpit doors. One of the most extraordinary of these wartime incidents involves a bomber crew, multiple men, an entire team of professionals trained to fly and fight together, who simply were not present when their aircraft returned. The plane had been in combat. That much was clear from the damage. It had flown through whatever it needed to fly through, and found its way back across the channel or the ocean or the mountain range that separated friendly territory from enemy. And it had descended, and it had come in for something that approached a landing, and when people reached it, the men were gone. All of them. No bodies, no parachutes confirmed as opened, no radio transmission explaining what had happened, just the machine faithful to the last, completing its journey without the hands that had guided it. You have to understand what it means in aviation for a plane to fly itself. Modern aircraft, the enormous jets that carry hundreds of passengers across oceans, have autopilot systems of extraordinary sophistication. They can take off, navigate, and land with minimal human input. But a Second World War bomber, or a small Cessna from the 1970s, or most of the aircraft involved in the cases we're talking about, these are not self-flying machines in any meaningful sense. They require constant attention. They require a hand on the controls, a mind reading the instruments, a body in the seat making the thousands of tiny adjustments that keep an aircraft in controlled, directed flight. For a plane like that to continue flying after the pilot disappears, to hold its course, to descend at an appropriate rate, to present itself to a runway at a survivable angle, that requires either a coincidence of such staggering improbability that it defies casual explanation, or something else. Something that aviation accident investigators have a very hard time writing into their reports. Let us talk about the physics for a moment, because the physics matter. When a light aircraft loses its pilot, when the hand comes off the yoke and the feet leave the rudder pedals and there is no one managing the throttle, what happens is not random. What happens is governed by the aerodynamic design of the aircraft, which in most small planes is deliberately engineered towards stability. The plane wants to fly level. It resists deviation. If you trim it correctly before you remove the pilot, and here's the crucial word before, it will maintain something close to level flight for a period of time. How long depends on the conditions. Wind, altitude, fuel load, the specific characteristics of the airframe. But it can be minutes. In some conditions it can be longer. And in those minutes, a plane that is behaving itself can cover a lot of distance, and even in the most extraordinary circumstances, find a runway. But finding a runway and landing on it are two very different things. Landing requires active management. It requires power reduction, attitude changes, gear extension if the aircraft has retractable gear, flap adjustment, precise speed control, continuous correction on the approach. A plane on autopilot, even a sophisticated one, does not simply descend from cruise altitude and set itself gently on a runway. It has to be told to do that. It has to be managed through each phase of the approach. And in the cases where the pilot has vanished and the plane has nonetheless appeared to land successfully enough at least, that the aircraft is found intact, the explanation that investigators reach for most often involves autopilot engagement, terrain following, or fuel exhaustion, where the plane simply ran out of fuel, the engine stopped, and the aircraft glided to the ground in a controlled but powerless descent that happened by chance or by the mercy of physics. To coincide with flat terrain or an airstrip. That explanation covers some of the cases. It covers the ones where the aircraft is found in a field or in shallow water or at the end of a runway with the damage of a hard but survivable landing. It covers the cases where the conclusion is that the pilot fell or jumped or was thrown from the aircraft, and the trimmed-up plane carried on until physics caught up with it. But it does not cover all the cases. There are cases that resist even that explanation, cases where the aircraft's instruments and flight data suggest something more deliberate, more guided, more intentional than a trimmed airplane running out of sky. The case of the Piper Cherokee that appeared over a major airfield in the late 1970s is one that aviation researchers have returned to again and again, not because it is definitively inexplicable, but because the chain of events is so precisely unlikely that explainable and inexplicable start to feel like the same thing. The aircraft had departed from a small regional airport on a solo cross-country flight. The pilot was experienced, the weather was clear, the route was straightforward. Somewhere over the middle section of the journey, contact was lost. Not unusual in itself, radio dead zones exist. Pilots sometimes forget to check in. The communication infrastructure of that era had gaps that modern systems have since filled. What was unusual was what happened several hours later when the Cherokee appeared in the pattern at a major airport. Not its destination, not a field the pilot was known to frequent, but a busy, controlled airport with an active tower, and flew 3 circuits of the pattern in a manner that the controllers on duty would later describe as competent. Not perfect. Not quite right in its spacing and altitude, but competent. Like someone who had some experience but was not entirely sure of the procedures at a busy field. The plane flew 3 circuits and then on the 4th approach came in and landed, hard, but intact. The tower had been talking to the aircraft the whole time. Nobody had answered. When they reached the plane, it was empty. The investigation that followed produced a finding of suicide. The pilot, it was determined, had opened the door in flight and jumped, having put the aircraft in a configuration that would, with some luck, allow it to fly on. The motive was established to investigators' satisfaction. The method was consistent with known aerodynamics. It was the most rational explanation available, and rational explanations are what accident reports are written to produce. But the people who were there, the controllers who watched that plane fly those circuits, the first responders who opened that door, they never fully made peace with the word competent. Because competent implied something, competent implied decision, and decision implied presence, and presence implied a pilot. The cases multiply when you start looking. They multiply across decades and continents and aircraft types. A military jet, both engines flamed out, glides to a landing on a closed runway in the Nevada desert with its pilot ejected miles back. A float plane in Canada sets down on a lake, bouncing twice before settling, with its single occupant missing and no explanation for how the aircraft navigated the mountain valley it had to thread to reach that lake. A commuter turboprop in Europe flies for 90 minutes past its destination and into the ocean, all crew incapacitated by hypoxia. The autopilot carrying the aircraft faithfully on its programmed course until the fuel runs out. And this is a case with an explanation. The Greece to Athens Helios Airways Flight 522 in 2005. One of the most carefully documented disasters in aviation history, and yet even knowing every detail of it, even understanding completely the mechanism by which the crew became incapacitated and the plane flew on unmanned, there's something in the story that resists the clinical language of the accident report. 90 minutes. Fighters scrambled to intercept. A cabin flight attendant, barely conscious, seen moving in the cockpit in the final moments, perhaps trying to reach the controls. The plane descending into the hills north of Athens with everyone aboard dead or dying, the last act of a crew that never had a chance, witnessed by jet pilots who could do nothing but watch. It is explained, completely explained, and still it haunts. Because that is the nature of these stories. The explanation, when it comes, does not always dissolve the mystery. It translates it. It moves it from the category of the unknown to the category of the known but terrible, and sometimes the known but terrible is harder to sit with than the simply unknown. At least the unknown leaves room for something other than horror. But let us return to the cases where the explanation is genuinely incomplete. Let us return to the cases where the investigators close the file not with certainty, but with the aviation equivalent of a shrug, undetermined or probable but unconfirmed, or consistent with a number of scenarios, none of which can be ruled out. These are the cases that feed the legend of the ghost plane. These are the cases that keep researchers and enthusiasts and pilots themselves up at night, staring at the ceiling and running through the aerodynamics one more time, trying to find the configuration, the trim setting, the exact sequence of events that would allow that specific aircraft to do what the evidence says it did. The Helios case, for all its horror, has a narrative. It has a cause and an effect. The cases that truly resist resolution are the ones where the narrative breaks down somewhere in the middle, where the chain of cause and effect has a link that simply is not there, where the evidence says point A and point C but point B, the connecting piece, the thing that explains how you get from the aircraft in normal flight to the aircraft empty on the runway, point B, is missing, not lost, not overlooked, not waiting in some archive to be rediscovered, just missing, as if whatever happened in that cockpit happened in a pocket of the world where the ordinary rules of evidence do not apply. Take the phenomenon as it extends into more recent times, into the era of GPS and flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders and satellite surveillance, the era when the idea of an aircraft simply vanishing from our awareness should be a relic of an older, less connected world. Take Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, which disappeared on the 8th of March, 2014 with 239 people aboard, and which, despite the most expensive search operation in aviation history, despite years of investigation, despite debris washing up on Indian Ocean beaches that confirmed the aircraft met the sea, has never been found in its entirety, and has never had its final moments fully explained. This is not a light aircraft on a training flight. This is a Boeing 777, a modern, sophisticated, heavily instrumented airliner, and it flew for approximately 7 hours after its last radar contact, crossing the Indian Ocean on a heading that no one aboard officially filed, speaking to no one, visible to no one, carrying the dead or the dying, or in the nightmare version that rational people try not to think about, the deliberately silenced. The plane that flew on without telling anyone where it was going. The plane that found the ocean instead of a runway, the ghost plane at the largest possible scale. The investigators who worked the MH370 case are some of the most experienced aviation accident professionals in the world, and what they have produced after years of work is a picture of what probably happened, painted in language so carefully hedged and qualified that it reads almost like a confession of limitation. They know the aircraft turned. They know it climbed and then descended. They know it flew south. They have satellite handshake data that places its final position within an arc of the southern Indian Ocean, and they have searched that arc, or much of it, without finding the fuselage. The most likely explanation that the crew was incapacitated, either through deliberate action by one of them or through some mechanical or environmental event, and the aircraft flew on autopilot until the fuel was exhausted, is consistent with the data. It is also consistent with several other scenarios that are darker and stranger, and that the investigators, bound by the protocols of their profession, cannot put into their official reports no matter what they may privately believe. MH370 is a ghost plane, the largest, most documented, most searched for ghost plane in history, and it is still, in every meaningful sense, a ghost. What does it mean that these things happen? What does it say about our relationship with the machines we have built to carry us through the sky that those machines can sometimes, under the right circumstances, outlive the people inside them and carry on without them, faithful to the last, completing journeys that their crews cannot? There is something almost loyal about it, something that if you were inclined to find meaning in mechanics you might almost read as devotion. The plane does not know its pilot is gone. The plane does not grieve. The plane simply continues to do what it was designed to do, which is fly. And it flies until it cannot fly anymore, and where it lands, if it lands, is wherever physics and fate and the geometry of the earth conspire to deposit it. The pilots who fly regularly, the professionals who spend their working lives in cockpits and know the precise behavior of their aircraft the way a musician knows an instrument, have complicated relationships with the idea of the ghost plane. Most of them will tell you, if you ask, that there is always an explanation. Always. The plane is a machine. Machines behave according to physical laws. If a plane does something, there is a mechanical reason it did that thing, and the job of the investigator is to find that reason. This is not cynicism. This is the working philosophy of a profession that cannot afford to leave room for the inexplicable, because inexplicable things in aviation tend to become lessons about why inexplicable things must be explained and then prevented. The goal is always to close the loop, always to find the point B that connects point A to point C, always to produce a finding that says here is what happened and here is what we will change so that it does not happen again. But the same pilots in the same conversations will sometimes pause. They will look at a particular case, not MH370, which is too large and too recent and too raw, but some older case, some file from 30 or 40 years ago, some aircraft found intact in a field with the fuel tanks dry and the pilot gone and no other explanation ever confirmed, and they will pause, and they will say something like, well, that one is interesting. And interesting in the language of pilots is a word that carries a great deal of weight. Interesting means I cannot fully account for this. Interesting means the machine did something I would not have expected. Interesting means I have run the numbers and the numbers do not quite add up. Interesting is, in the careful, controlled vocabulary of aviation, the closest thing you will hear to I do not know. And I do not know is the phrase that haunts all of these stories. It haunts the investigators and the witnesses and the families of the missing and the controllers who watched the plane fly its circuits and the mechanics who inspected the aircraft afterward and found nothing wrong with it. I do not know is the residue that these cases leave behind, the thing that sticks to you after you have read every report and watched every documentary and heard every expert opinion and still find yourself, in a quiet moment, thinking about an empty cockpit and a plane that should not have been able to do what the evidence says it did. There is a case from Australia, from the late 1970s, that is perhaps the most famous of all the ghost plane stories, and it has resisted resolution for so long and so completely that it has passed from the realm of aviation accident investigation into something approaching mythology. Frederick Valentich, 20 years old, student pilot, flying a Cessna 182 over the Bass Strait on the night of October 21, 1978 on a training flight to King Island. He contacts Melbourne Air Traffic Control with a report that is, even now, difficult to read without feeling the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. He reports an aircraft above him. Large, 4 bright lights, moving at high speed. He asks the controller to confirm whether there is any known traffic in his area. There is not. The aircraft, whatever it is, comes back. It approaches his Cessna. He describes a metallic surface, a green light. He says it is hovering above him. He sounds confused and frightened in a way that is not quite like fear of the dark or fear of the weather. It is the fear of encountering something that does not fit into any category you have been trained to think about. And then there is a metallic scraping sound, and then there is silence. And the aircraft and Frederick Valentich are never found. No debris, no wreckage, no body, no aircraft, nothing in the vast shallow waters of the Bass Strait that should have been impossible to hide. The official finding is that the disappearance is presumed fatal. The cause is unknown. The aircraft was never recovered. Every explanation that has been offered in the 40-plus years since UFO encounter, misidentification of a natural phenomenon, deliberate disappearance staged to fake a death, spatial disorientation leading to a controlled flight into terrain that was never located, every single one of them fails to account for all of the evidence. The UFO explanation fails to account for the subsequent silence. The spatial disorientation explanation fails to account for the lack of wreckage. The staged disappearance explanation fails to account for the genuine terror in his voice on that final radio transmission. Everything fails. The case is a locked room with no room inside it, a puzzle that does not resolve into any picture you can name. Valentich's case is extreme. It sits at the outermost edge of the ghost plane phenomenon, in the zone where ghost plane and vanished plane become the same thing, where the question is not where did the pilot go but where did everything go. Most ghost plane cases are less total in their mystery. Most of them leave the aircraft. The aircraft is the evidence, the artifact, the physical record that something happened. It is the very presence of the aircraft, intact and flyable and empty, that transforms a simple disappearance into a riddle. Because disappearances are common and aircraft accidents are common, and even mid-air emergencies that end in a pilot's death are in the grim calculus of aviation history not uncommon. What is uncommon, what is genuinely, stubbornly, provocatively strange, is the aircraft that comes back. Think about what the aircraft coming back means. It means that the journey was completed. It means that whatever happened to the person inside it, the machine continued its function, continued its purpose, continued to do the thing it was built to do even after the human element was removed. It is in its way a testament to engineering. The aircraft was built so well, trimmed so carefully, placed in such favorable conditions, that it could do without its pilot what it was designed to do with one. And yet that testament is also a horror, because we do not build aircraft to fly without pilots, we build them to carry people. The aircraft that returns without its pilot has completed a journey that it was never meant to make alone, and in completing it, it has left behind every question that matters. Who was flying? What happened? Where did they go? Why is the seat empty? The legend of the ghost plane feeds on those questions. It feeds on the space between what we know and what we can prove, the gap between the physical evidence and the human story that the physical evidence is trying to tell. In that gap, in that space, the imagination does what imaginations do. It fills the emptiness with whatever it fears or hopes or cannot reconcile with the ordinary workings of a world governed by physics and reason, and the patient, methodical procedures of accident investigation. Some people fill it with the supernatural. Some people fill it with conspiracy. Some people fill it with the romantic image of a pilot who simply could not bear to land, who chose the sky over the earth and kept climbing until there was no more sky. None of these are satisfying. None of them are true, or if they are true, we cannot prove it, which in the world of evidence and record amounts to the same thing. What we can say with confidence is this: aircraft have returned to the Earth without their pilots. They have done so in ways that range from the mechanically explicable to the genuinely puzzling. The pilots have died in their seats and fallen from open doors and ejected and been incapacitated by hypoxia, and in a very small number of cases, the cases that are still open, the cases that still carry the notation undetermined, have simply ceased to be present in their aircraft in a manner that the investigators who examined every inch of the physical evidence could not definitively explain. Those cases are few. They are not a trend. They are not evidence of a phenomenon that defies physics or requires a revision of what we understand about aviation or about the world. They are simply the cases where the evidence was insufficient, where the truth of what happened was lost with the pilot or destroyed in the accident or dissolved in the ocean, and what remains is the record of an event that we know occurred but cannot fully describe. And yet those cases matter, not because they prove anything supernatural, not because they should change the way we think about physics or accident investigation, but because of what they do to the people who encounter them. The controller who watched the circuits, the mechanic who inspected the aircraft, the investigator who wrote the report. These people carry the empty cockpit with them. They carry the question of point B, the missing link. They lie awake and they run the numbers one more time, and they come up against the same limit they have always come up against, and they add it to the small collection of limits that every thoughtful person accumulates across a life, the things that happen that cannot quite be accounted for, the events that the available tools of explanation cannot fully reach. They do not abandon reason. They do not become believers in the supernatural. They become, in a very specific and limited way, humble. They become people who know from direct encounter with the evidence that the world contains, in small but real measure, things that happened and cannot be fully explained. That is not a comfortable place to stand. It is not a place that most of us willingly inhabit. We want the explanation. We want point B. We want the investigator to close the file with a finding that accounts for everything, that leaves no question open, that allows us to say, yes, now I understand, now I can move on. And in most cases, we get that. In most cases, the investigation finds the answer, and the answer, though it may be terrible, is complete. But in a few cases, in the ghost plane cases, the real ones, the ones that still sit in that notation of undetermined, we do not get that. We get the aircraft, empty and intact, and we get the silence where the pilot used to be, and we get the question hanging in the air of the empty cockpit that nobody has been able to answer. You can look at that question and be frightened by it, or you can look at it and be awed by it. You can look at the empty seat and think about the human being who sat there, who lifted that aircraft off the runway and flew it into a sky that, on that particular day or night, became the last sky they ever saw. You can think about what it means that their machine survived them. You can think about whether that is a comfort or a cruelty, whether there is anything meaningful in the faithfulness of a machine that does not know its pilot is gone and simply continues, as machines do, to do the thing it was made for. You can think about all of this, and at the end of all that thinking, you will be exactly where the investigators are, exactly where the controllers are, exactly where every thoughtful person who has spent time with these cases ends up. Sitting with an open question in a closed file, looking at a plane that came back without its pilot, and asking the only question that has ever mattered. Where did they go? The sky is very large, it keeps its secrets well, and the planes that return without their pilots carry those secrets on their wings, flying them home like cargo that can never be unloaded, evidence of a journey that only one of the travelers completed, testimony to the silence that fills every space where a human being used to be. The empty cockpit is the most honest thing in aviation. It does not speculate, it does not theorize. It does not offer the comfort of a probable cause or the resolution of a final report. It simply sits there, seat and controls and instruments all in their proper places, everything exactly as it should be except for the one thing that matters, the one thing that cannot be replaced by physics or engineering or the faithful performance of a well-trimmed aircraft, the one thing that was there when the plane took off and was not there when the plane came back. The pilot, the person. The human being who went up into the sky and somewhere between leaving and returning became one of aviation's most persistent mysteries. Not a number in a report, not a probable cause. A person whose story ends with terrible and beautiful precision in the middle of the air.